You never really ask for much, not praise, not gifts, not the center of attention. All you ever wanted was to be seen for who you are, not the version you learned to play, not the role you were trained to survive with, just you. But being understood, that was rare, too rare. So rare, it started to feel like a luxury you weren't allowed to touch. So you adjusted. You made yourself easier to love by hiding the parts that were hard to hold. You became quieter when you were loud, smaller when you were full, kinder when you were angry, wiser when you were hurt. You became good at playing roles that made others stay, even if those roles made you disappear. And still, when someone said, "I love you," something inside of you whispered, "But do you really understand me?" Because love that doesn't see you, love that doesn't hear the ache behind your silence, isn't love. It's approval, and approval doesn't heal you. It trains you to perform. But being understood, it feels like love, real love, not the version that tells you to fix yourself to fit, not the version that rewards your silence with affection, but the kind of love that stops you mid-sentence and says, "You don't have to explain, I already know." That kind of love makes you cry without knowing why, because suddenly you don't feel crazy anymore. You feel real, you feel allowed, you feel held. If you're still chasing that feeling, if you've never truly felt what it means to be understood, stay. This is for you. And if it finds you at the right time, don't just listen, let yourself be felt. If this speaks to a part of you that rarely has a voice, subscribe and stay close. We create this space for people like you. You don't need to heal alone. Sometimes it starts young. Maybe it was the way your parents nodded but didn't really hear. Maybe it was the way your teacher said, "You're too sensitive," when all you did was feel deeply what others ignored. You learned to carry the weight of your feelings like they were shameful, like they were too much for the world. So you swallowed them, and over time your truth got quieter. Not because it stopped hurting, but because no one seemed to notice when it did. You mastered the art of saying "I'm fine," while your inner world collapsed like a silent avalanche. And the strange thing is, no one ever questioned it. No one stopped long enough to ask what the silence was hiding. You became so good at being strong, they forgot to wonder if you were ever allowed to fall apart. So when someone finally paused, when someone finally looked you in the eye and saw through the smile, you didn't know what to do with that. It felt like being exposed, like someone had opened a door in a room you had locked for years, and it scared you, because being seen meant being known, and being known meant being vulnerable. But a small part of you, the part you buried under all the pretending, that part ached to be found. So when someone said, "I get it, I've been there," your walls shook, not because of the words, but because of the way they said it, as if they weren't trying to fix you, as if they weren't scared of your sadness, as if finally your pain didn't make you unlovable. There's something sacred about that moment. When someone holds your truth without flinching, when they don't interrupt, don't solve, don't judge, they just stay, and in their stillness, your chaos feels less alone, not erased, not diluted, just witnessed. That kind of witnessing is rare. It's the kind that makes your nervous system breathe for the first time in years, like your body finally feels safe enough to exist. You don't need them to say the perfect thing. You just need them not to look away. You remember moments like that. Maybe there were only 2 or 3 in your whole life, but they branded themselves into your memory, didn't they? The time someone sat with you in silence and didn't try to make it go away. The time someone let you be angry without shrinking away. The time someone didn't ask, "Why are you like this?" but instead said, "Of course you feel that way." Moments like that, they live longer than years of applause, because they weren't given to the version of you that was acceptable. They were given to the parts you usually hide. And something changes in you when that happens. Something quiet but permanent. You stop needing to explain so much. You stop apologizing for how deeply you feel. You stop rewriting your words to sound less broken, because now you know someone out there gets it. Even if it was just once. Even if it was just a stranger who saw you cry in public and didn't turn away. Even if it was just a sentence in a book that mirrored your pain so perfectly, you had to close it and breathe through the ache. Being understood doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it shows up for 5 seconds and changes everything. And maybe that's why you're here now. Maybe that's why this voice, this story, feels like something you weren't supposed to hear but did, because your soul is starving for resonance. Not noise, not advice, not validation, just resonance. A moment where someone else's truth feels like it was written from inside your own chest. And when you find it, you don't even need the person to stay. You just need that one clean second where you remember you are not alone in the way you feel. You are not strange. You are not too much. You are not a puzzle that no one can solve. You're just someone who needed a certain kind of mirror, one that didn't distort you to fit their comfort. You're just someone who was waiting to be understood, and maybe, just maybe, you're starting to be. But it's not easy, is it? Because once you get a taste of being understood, everything that isn't starts to feel unbearable. The small talk feels louder. The half-hearted texts feel colder. The people who only love your light but run from your shadows, they start to feel like ghosts. Even when they're standing right in front of you, you try to go back, try to shrink again, try to fit into conversations where your truth doesn't belong, but it's like trying to wear a coat that doesn't fit anymore. Your skin remembers. Your heart remembers. And even if your mind begs you to stay quiet, your soul keeps whispering, "This is not it. This is not real." And that's when the loneliness sharpens. Not the loneliness of being alone, the loneliness of being misunderstood. While surrounded by people who think they know you, you smile, but your eyes search for someone who sees deeper. You talk, but you wonder if anyone hears the words you don't say. And maybe that's why you've always felt tired. Not tired from doing too much, but tired from not being allowed to be fully you, because pretending is exhausting. Editing yourself every day to be palatable, to be digestible, to be liked. It chips away at your spirit, and then someone comes along, or a message, or a story, and for a fleeting second, you exhale. Because for once, you don't have to translate your heart. You don't have to repackage your feelings in bite-sized comfort. You can just feel, and that feels like oxygen. It doesn't fix everything. It doesn't erase the wounds, but it anchors you, like someone just reached into your storm and said, "I'm not leaving. You don't scare me." And in a world that constantly tells you to soften your truth, that moment is revolutionary, because finally, you don't have to fight for space. You are the space. But here's the part. No one tells you. Once you've been truly seen, once someone has looked past the surface and met you where your truth lives, you can't go back to anything less. You can't pretend that surface-level affection is enough. You can't convince yourself that being tolerated feels like love. You can't unknow the difference between being admired and being understood, because admiration asks for performance, but understanding asks for presence. And maybe that's why you've been pulling away from certain people lately, not out of pride, not out of drama, but out of quiet self-respect, because you've outgrown places where you can't be real. And that doesn't make you cold, that makes you healing. You used to think that being chosen was the goal, that if someone picked you, it meant you mattered. But now you're learning that it's not about being chosen, it's about being known without having to shapeshift to be picked. You're learning that love without understanding feels like applause with no echo. It sounds loud, but it doesn't land anywhere inside you. And you're not broken for wanting more. You're not dramatic for craving depth. You're not needy for wishing someone would ask how you really are and wait for the honest answer. You're just human. A human who's felt invisible in rooms where you gave everything. A human who's tired of translating your soul into a language they'll accept. A human who's finally learning that being understood is not a luxury, it's a need. And slowly, you're starting to make peace with that. You're no longer begging for closeness that costs you your truth. You're no longer settling for connection that feels like captivity. You're no longer watering yourself down just to be loved. Because now you know, being understood is how love breathes. It's how love feels safe. It's how love stops being a performance and starts becoming a place. And maybe that's why you've always carried a kind of homesickness. Not for a place, but for a person, or a feeling, or a moment when you could finally exhale and say, "This is where I'm allowed to exist." Some people search their whole lives for that moment. Some get glimpses. A friend who listened without fixing. A lover who noticed the things you never said. A stranger whose eyes softened when yours were tired. And even if those moments didn't last, they carved something permanent in you. A knowing, a standard, a quiet refusal to settle for anything that doesn't see you anymore. And yes, it makes you lonelier at times. Because once you've touched real, you lose the appetite for almost. You find yourself drifting from the crowd, craving depth in a world built for speed. You talk less. You listen more. You value stillness over noise, honesty over charm, and presence over performance. And somewhere along that path, you start seeing yourself a little clearer too. You notice the way you've bent for others. You recognize the places where you've abandoned yourself just to belong. And it hurts, but it heals, because finally, you can name the wound. You were never too much. You were just too deep for the shallow love you were given. And that changes everything. It changes the way you date, the way you choose friends, the way you respond to half-hearted affection. You no longer beg for attention from people who don't even deserve access. You no longer shape yourself into someone else's comfort zone. You no longer hide your cows just to keep someone near. You start asking different questions. Do they understand silence? Do they notice my eyes before my words? Do they want me? Or do they want what I can perform for them? And when the answer is unclear, you learn to walk away not because you're cold, but because you finally remembered. Being half-loved is a slow death, and you are not here to slowly disappear. Somewhere deep inside, you always knew. You knew there had to be more than love that asked you to shrink, more than conversations that left you emptier than silence, more than relationships where your depth was treated like a flaw. You knew not because anyone taught you, but because your soul refused to settle. It whispered in the quiet, "This isn't it, keep going," even when you doubted it, even when the loneliness clawed at you, even when you questioned if you were just too difficult to love. That voice stayed, and now, you're starting to listen to it again. You're rebuilding the bridge back to yourself, not all at once, not perfectly, but truthfully, and with each step you're discovering what love was always meant to feel like. It doesn't rush you, it doesn't mute you, it doesn't demand a performance. It meets you in the raw, in the real, in the ruins. It holds space when you have no words. It stays when your mask falls off. It sees the mess and doesn't flinch. That kind of love doesn't just come from others. Sometimes it starts with you, the way you stop apologizing for your sensitivity, the way you grieve the years you spent silencing yourself, the way you choose people who speak the same emotional language, the way you look in the mirror and say, "I see you, I hear you, I'm not leaving." Because at some point, the most powerful thing you can do is understand yourself first, not through logic, not through productivity, but through compassion. You stop dissecting your reactions like they're wrong. You stop labeling your needs as too much. You stop trying to earn what you should have always been given freely. And in that softness, you become the very thing you were searching for. A safe place, a quiet knowing, a home. And when someone else finds you there, not the version you constructed, but the version you've come home to, you'll feel it instantly. Not in your head, not in words, but in that gentle, unmistakable exhale of your soul that says, finally. It will feel almost unreal at first. When someone truly sees you, not just the version you've learned to display, but the version underneath the armor, it'll make you pause. You'll question it. You'll brace for the moment they pull away, because that's what you were trained to expect, wasn't it? That if you show too much, feel too deeply, ask for too many layers of connection, you'll be left behind. So even when they lean in, you'll flinch. Even when they stay, you'll wait for the silence. Even when they hold space for your pain, you'll wonder if it's just temporary. But over time, if it's real, you'll start to believe them. Not because of grand declarations, but because of how they listen, because of how they don't run when you unravel, because of how they choose presence, when the easy thing would be to look away. And that's when the healing begins. Not all at once, not in some cinematic explosion of closure, but in slow, sacred moments, where you begin to trust that you're allowed to be whole, that you don't have to slice yourself into acceptable pieces, that you don't have to trade truth for touch, that you don't have to mute the parts of you that are still aching. You realize love isn't about being adored for your brightness. It's about being held when you go dark. And when that kind of love arrives, quiet, consistent, unafraid, you don't feel fireworks. You feel safety. You feel stillness. You feel known. And in a world that constantly tells you to perform, that kind of love feels radical. But it's not just possible, it's deserved. You are not asking for too much. You are just asking in places that have too little. Keep asking, keep reaching, keep becoming. Because one day, someone will look at you the way you've always needed to be seen, and you'll recognize it not with your eyes, but with your bones, and it'll feel like coming home. And maybe the most beautiful part is this. When you're finally understood, you begin to understand others differently too. Not with judgment, not with the need to fix, but with a kind of empathy that comes from having walked through fire barefoot. You start to hear the silence behind someone's "I'm okay." You start to notice the twitch in their smile, the way their hands fidget when their heart wants to scream. You see how much they're carrying behind their eyes. Because now, you know what it feels like to be unread for years, to scream without sound, to hope someone, anyone, will lean in and say, "I see through that. You don't have to pretend with me." You become the person you once needed, and that changes everything. You show up softer. You stop demanding perfection. You start asking better questions. Not, "What do you do?" but, "Who holds you when you fall apart?" Not, "Are you happy?" but, "Do you feel safe being real?" You start creating spaces where masks aren't needed, where people can cry without explaining, where laughter doesn't hide pain and silence doesn't mean disconnection. Because once you've been understood, you realize it's not a privilege to withhold. It's a gift to offer freely. You no longer chase attention. You become attuned. You no longer cling to relationships that require your disappearance. You open to the ones that allow your entire being. And the people who can't meet you there, you let them go. Not from anger, not from bitterness, but from the deep clarity that says, "I won't abandon myself for connection ever again." Because now, you know what your soul feels like when it's safe. You know what your body does when it's no longer bracing for rejection. You know what love sounds like when it doesn't come with conditions. It sounds like breath, like stillness, like truth without performance. It sounds like your own voice, finally unmuted. And in that space, you don't just feel loved. You feel real. You begin to remember things you thought you'd forgotten. The child who used to speak without hesitation. The teenager who used to write late at night because it was the only place she could be honest. The version of you before the world taught you to edit your truth. They come back slowly, cautiously, peeking through the cracks you once sealed shut. And you don't chase them away this time. You welcome them, because now you understand. You weren't broken. You were silenced. You weren't dramatic. You were honest in a world that prefers masks. You weren't too intense. You were vivid. And they weren't ready to handle full color. And maybe that's why you've always felt like an outsider. Not because you didn't belong, but because you weren't willing to bury yourself just to fit in. You feel everything, deeply, painfully, beautifully, and for a long time, that felt like a weakness. Until someone came along and said, "That's the best thing about you." And it rewrote something ancient inside of you. Not because you needed their approval, but because something in you had waited so long to be mirrored. To be told, yes, that part of you, the one you hide, it's worthy of love too. You stop trying to make sense to people who only understand surfaces. You stop translating your joy, your grief, your rage, your softness. You started letting it all just be. Messy, unfiltered, whole. And in doing so, you became a sanctuary. Not just for others, but for yourself. Because understanding yourself is what makes you powerful. But being understood by someone else, that's what makes you human. And that's what this is about, isn't it? Not being perfect, not being healed, not being easy to love, just being felt all the way through. No edits, no masks, no translation, just you, understood. And now, everything begins to shift. The way you move through the world changes. Not dramatically, not with some sudden reinvention, but in small, quiet ways that only the real ones notice. You pause before replying, not to calculate the perfect answer, but to ask yourself what you truly feel. You enter rooms differently, not looking for where you fit, but feeling into whether your soul is welcome. You choose slowness over urgency, depth over performance, and people who speak to your spirit, not your ego, because you're no longer starving. You've tasted what it's like to be fed emotionally, and now you can't go back to crumbs. You don't need 10 voices telling you that you're enough. You just need your own voice. Steady, grounded, and no longer desperate for proof. You start trusting the quiet. You stop chasing the noise. And even on the lonely days, you no longer abandon yourself just to be close to someone else. That's the beauty of being understood. It doesn't just change how you feel, it changes what you choose. You start saying no to what drains you, to what confuses your nervous system, to what asks for your light, but runs from your darkness. You no longer tolerate emotional guesswork. You want people who ask, who notice, who listen when you pause, and stay when you shake. You stop asking, how do I become lovable? And start asking, who already knows that I am? And when you find those people, those rare, steady souls, who love in ways that don't require explanation, you'll feel it deep in your bones. Safe, not because everything is perfect, but because you no longer need to prove your worth. You just are. And in that space, love isn't earned, it's recognized. You'll look back one day, and it'll hit you how many years you spent aching in silence, how often you dimmed your light, not out of humility, but because you were afraid no one would stay. If they saw the whole of you, you'll remember the way your voice used to tremble when you tried to speak your truth, the way your body used to tense when love felt conditional, and it'll break your heart a little. Not because you were weak, but because you were brave for far too long. You survived in spaces that never learned your language. You gave and then apologized for being empty, but not anymore. Now you guard your heart, not with walls, but with wisdom. You let people in, but only if they knock with gentleness. You share your softness, but only where it won't be weaponized. You no longer confuse intensity for intimacy. You've learned that real connection is quiet, steady, safe, and most of all clear. There's no guessing, no casing, no decoding mixed signals, just honesty, presence, and that sacred look in someone's eyes that says, I'm here, I see you, and I'm not going anywhere. You deserve that, not because you're perfect, not because you've done the healing, but because you're human, and your humanity, in all its messy, radiant, honest form, is enough. So let this be the turning point. Let this be the moment you stop reaching for what hurts. Let this be the season you stop settling for connection that confuses your nervous system. Let this be the first time you say, I will not abandon myself ever again, because from now on, love must feel like understanding, or it isn't love at all.